Hello everyone, my name's Eleanor and I'm the Education Manager at Benjamin Franklin House. Welcome to this, our third class in this series of virtual history classes, all about the Georgian period. And this week we're going to be thinking about what family life was like in the 18th century, particularly thinking about what life was like for children. Before we get started, just a couple of notes about how you can participate today. I can see some familiar names, but also some new names joining us. So just a reminder that I'm going to be asking you questions and you may well have questions to me as we're going through the class. There's a few ways you can take part. So you can use the raise hand button. And if you press that, I can unmute your microphone and you can speak over the audio. You can also use the chat and type in there, and also the Q&A as well. And you may be watching this, we are recording the class today, so you may be watching this on our website or on YouTube. And in that case, you can always get in touch with me with any questions you might have. My email is education@benjaminfranklinhouse.org. Brilliant. So I can see we have some more comments in the chat. So hello to Enid, hello to Stella, hello to Samina. So fantastic to see you joining us today. So as I said, our topic for the week is looking at children and families in the Georgian period. But as ever, let's just a quick reminder of who Benjamin Franklin was and why there's a house named after him in London. So here on the left, we have a lovely illustration of Benjamin Franklin, and then Benjamin Franklin House. So maybe some of those of you who've joined us before could fill us in with something you know already about Benjamin Franklin and his house. Hello to Joe and to Philippa too. I can see some raised hands, fantastic. Hi Enid.
Hi, it's called Benjamin Franklin House because Benjamin Franklin lived there for a period of time. He also was there for science and politics.
Great explanation. Thanks, Enid.
You're welcome.
Fantastic. So yes, so that is why Benjamin Franklin was in London, mainly for his politics, but also for his science. He's also known as a printer and a writer. So he did lots of things in his long life. And he lived in this building, you can see on the right, that we now call Benjamin Franklin House for about 16 years, just before the War of Independence, when America broke away and became its own independent country. Okay, I can see some more raised hands. Let's see if anyone else would like to add anything. Hello to Maxie. Hello.
Hello. I believe that Benjamin Franklin was one of America's founding fathers.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. That's probably what he's best known for. Thank you so much. Okay, so you may have been wondering what Benjamin Franklin is doing on the left. We mentioned that he was a scientist, and some of you have mentioned in the chat how he created a piano-like instrument that was called the glass harmonica. He actually did that at Craven Street. And someone else has mentioned a lightning rod, probably his most famous invention. But here on the left, we see him with another invention of his called the odometer, or at least it's his version. They existed before, but he created this more modern version. And one of the reasons he created the odometer is because amongst his many other jobs, he was called the Deputy Postmaster General for the colonies. So he was in charge of making sure that all the horses and carts, rather than cars in those days, was delivering the post using the most direct route. So if the odometer would measure the distances they traveled, and so he could make sure that they were taking the most direct route. So lots of interesting inventions that Benjamin Franklin created. And so that period when he was living on Craven Street, so between 1757 and 1775, that was in the 18th century, and a period we call the Georgian period, because there were several kings called George. So that's why we're running these history classes all about that period of time. And as I said, this week, we're going to be thinking about children and family. So I'm going to start with a question for you. And I wonder what you think was different for children in the Georgian period. Maybe using things you've done already in other classes you've attended, or things you knew already. Hello, Philippa. Hello, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think they had different toys.
They did definitely have different toys, and in a few weeks we're going to have a session all about Georgian fun and games. So I'll go into more detail about the toys, and then we'll definitely talk a bit about them this week. So great to see so many hands up. Hello, Bronwyn.
That they didn't go to school.
Right. So some went to school, but most of them not. We're gonna cover that. Let's see what we've got in the chat as well. So thinking about what it was like for poor children and rich children and how it would have been different, for boys and girls. A lot of people talking about school. Okay, lots of differences, fantastic. And I'll go to one more hands up now, and then we'll come back to hands up a bit later in the class. Hello, is that Georgia?
Girls wouldn't learn.
Right, so they definitely would. It would be different between boys and girls. And although some boys went to school, and most girls didn't. So we'll talk all about that. Fantastic, really know lots already. Great. So if you were able to join us last week for our session on Georgian society in class, we looked at how life was very different for different sections of society in the Georgian period. And I wonder if anyone remembers the main three classes that there were by the time we got to the Georgian period. Let's see in the chat too. Okay, so now thinking, and you had mentioned about the difference between rich and poor. Okay, hi Enid.
Hi, it's rich, middle, and poor.
Yes, exactly. So rich or upper class, middle classes, and then the lower classes who are much poorer. Great, thank you. And if you didn't manage to join us at our last class, then it's available on our website and on YouTube as well if you want to catch up. So we're going to go through those different classes and think about what life was like for children and families in those classes. So let's start with the upper classes. Okay. So upper class children. So we've got this beautiful portrait on the left. This is from the Tate Britain, and it shows the Bradshaw family. So we can tell, we spoke a bit last week about historical sources and how paintings were really useful as primary sources that historians can learn about the past from. And this is an example of one. So this is a kind of a typical depiction of a gentleman's family. They're in beautiful natural scene there, and they've got their very kind of fancy elaborate clothes on. And so the father of the family is in the middle. He is a gentleman called Thomas Bradshaw, and he was a politician. So if you remember, if you joined us for our last class, you'll remember that politician was one of the jobs that those upper class families or men would, it was sort of honourable for them to do. So he was a politician, and he's got his big family here. So this lady on the right is his wife, Elizabeth. And then we've got his eldest son, who was called Barrington, here on the left. And I don't know if you can see, but he's holding a toy, and part of it's over here. And someone was asking about toys. Can anyone see what he's playing with in this portrait? Hello, is that Jack?
Hello. I think it's a kite.
It is a kite, exactly. We think a lot about kites with Benjamin Franklin because he did his famous kite and key experiment. So here he is playing with a kite. And then the other eldest son, who's called Robert, he's here with a pony. Now, last week, somebody asked about whether the Georgians had pets. And certainly, particularly in the upper classes, a lot of them would have learned how to ride a horse. We've got that kind of reflected here with the pony. And they might have had cats and dogs as pets as well. Some very rich people, it was very fashionable and a kind of signal of your wealth if you actually had some exotic animals in what people would call a menagerie as well. So zoos didn't really take off until a bit later, but some very wealthy private families would have their own almost kind of private zoo. And then, so we've got the aunt, so the sister of Thomas Bradshaw here, and then the two younger children. So one of these children is Elizabeth and one was Lawrence. So a girl and a boy, you might have noticed they're dressed very similarly. And thinking about Georgian fashions, so in the time, until children were a little bit older, so when they were really young, kind of babies and toddlers, they would all wear dresses, whether they were boys or girls. So sometimes it could be a bit difficult to figure out who was who. So that's a difference from today. And so we've got this lovely scene, and kind of lots of displays of their wealth and their status here. And then thinking about what life would have been like for them. I can see we have some hands up though, so I'll go to those questions and then get more into the detail of what life was like for them. Hello, is that Maxie?
Hello, I was just wondering, I thought that the Bradshaw family was famous for some reason. I can't remember why.
It's possible. And it's quite a common name, so I don't know if it was these Bradshaws, but he was a politician, so he had some quite important jobs. And of course, their portraits in the Tate Britain, so it must have been fairly well known. But do get back to me if you remember what they might have been famous for. Got lots of comments in the chat as well. Okay, everyone's noticing the kite and the pony as well. So let's think about what life would have been like. So although in a lot of these official portraits, it would show the whole family together, it would vary from family to family, but it was quite common for the parents to not really have a big role in the children's lives, particularly the fathers. They might not see them very often. And so there'd be lots of staff that would be involved in kind of raising the children. So there'd be a nursery that might be in quite a separate part of the house. And some parents would want their children to eat with them at mealtime, but sometimes they would keep quite separate in the nursery, and they would have kind of nursery maids. And then as it got a bit older, they might also have governesses. And on the picture on the right, you can see a governess. So that would be someone who would be responsible for teaching the children at home. And this looks like it's probably in a nursery, because hopefully you can see on the floor there's some more games here. So a kind of early version of badminton. Maybe you can just about see the shuttlecock, and I think some playing cards here. So they would start their education. And then a lot of people, when they were thinking about what would have been different for children in the Georgian period, commented on education. You're quite right, it was different. So it was also different for boys and girls. So in very wealthy upper class families, it would be tradition for boys to be sent away to boarding school quite young, probably about 13. And some of the boarding schools they would have been sent to still exist, so places like Eton and Harrow. And they would have stayed there most of the time, and then the idea would have been they would have gone on to university. Whereas the girls would have stayed at home most likely, and but still may have received some education from governesses, for example, although often it would be, like we mentioned last time, quite centered around kind of getting prepared for marriage. So learning skills like playing musical instruments, needlework and embroidery. So really quite different for boys and girls. I can see we have some hands up, so let's see if anyone wants to add anything. Hello, is that Philippa?
Yes, I think the two children who are dressed up similar, maybe they're twins.
They do look like they could be a similar age. I think potentially the one with the mother is a little bit younger. But as I said, so for those early years of the life of a child's life, they would all be wearing dresses, whether they were boys or girls. Okay, fantastic. So that was the upper classes. Let's see now how life would have been quite different for the middle classes. Okay, so whereas we've got that beautiful portrait on the last slide, it's actually quite difficult. There's not so many representations of the middle classes. They wouldn't have had the money to commission those very expensive portraits. So the painting on the left is actually from the Netherlands rather than from Britain, but it's just the early 18th century, and it shows a draper's shop. So we spoke last time about how there was a big expansion in population in the cities, and hand in hand with that, there was a lot more shopping. And so these kind of trades like shopkeepers and things were really growing, and that's why we had many more people in the middle classes. So we've got two children in this painting. I think it looks like this child at the doorway actually has come from outside. So he's maybe more from the lower classes that we'll go on to in a moment. He hasn't got his shoes on. And it looks like this gentleman sat here is giving him some money, maybe to run an errand. However, this boy here seems to be part of the family, the Draper's family. And you can see he's got a dog. We were thinking about pets earlier. He seems to be playing with some dice. So there was an element of that sort of childhood play. but actually they would have also been kind of helping out in the shop if that was the case. And you may have been surprised to hear how young some of the upper class boys would leave home to go to school, but about at a similar age or even younger sometimes, middle class children would probably also be leaving home to go and start working. So maybe as domestic servants, or to be starting an apprenticeship, so kind of training for working. And again, that was a big part of the growth of the middle classes, getting these kind of skills for particular jobs, things like tailors and metal workers and weavers, things that you could train to do as an apprentice. And we can see that happening in the other picture on the screen. So this is much later, so at the beginning of the 19th century, which is the end of the Georgian period. It's from Bristol, and we can see it's a lamplighter. So it didn't have electric lamps in the streets yet in Georgian's times, but by the end of the Georgian period, there were lots of gas lamps in the cities at least. And you can see here he's got a much younger helper, so that would have been apprentice kind of learning the trade alongside him. Let's see if we've got some questions or anything anyone wants to add. Hello?
Yes.
Did you have a question or anything you wanted to add?
Yes, they had no laptops.
Absolutely. So not only did they not have kind of...
They didn't know how to make them.
Yeah, exactly. They wouldn't have had all of that technology yet. So very different times. Hello, someone else?
What did the money look like in those days?
That's a very good question. So it's different to today. So it would have been mostly coins. So I think it would have been some notes as well. I'll have to get back to you on that one. I'll do a bit of investigating and get back to you. But great question. What life would have been like for the lower classes. So really quite difficult. Okay, here we go. So we spoke again last time about how the populations in the cities were really growing, and this was partly because of the Industrial Revolution that was happening. So there were lots more factories, and as a result of that, there were lots of jobs that needed doing in the factories. And a lot of these jobs were less skilled than those trades that I just mentioned with the middle classes. And so poorer families would go in and do those jobs, and they were often very, very difficult. So a lot of the factories were making textiles, so making clothes. You can see that here on the left. And indeed, children sometimes would do very difficult and quite dangerous jobs because they were smaller. They might be asked to kind of clean the machines and things. So really difficult work, and it could be quite dangerous. They would have to work really long days, often like 13-hour days, maybe 6 days of the week. And by the early 19th century, the Industrial Revolution started around 1860. So over that sort of 40, 50 years, there was about 1 million child workers in Britain. And a lot of these lower class families, the children were starting to work at a younger age as well. So about 350,000 of those child workers were between 7 and 10. So really young to be starting to work so hard. And we mentioned last time how because of this population growth, often living conditions would be not very good in the cities. That's what you can see on the right, kind of slums in some areas in the cities. And there were these things called the poor laws that were to try and support those families. So you'd have workhouses that would give them accommodation and food, but they would be kind of working very hard in return. So really a very, very hard life. And this is thinking about the in the cities, but also in the countryside. Children would have been working quite young too. So often on farms, a whole family would be employed. So they'd all have different jobs that they were doing. So really a much harder life in many ways than we know today. I can see lots of raised hands, which is fantastic. So I'll go to those. Hello, is that Stella?
Hi. I had a kind of odd question, and
That's
somebody
okay.
else just also asked. So I know this is an answer that the other person asked, but I was wondering, why do these pictures of the lower classes black and white?
Yeah, so I know
Sorry,
it looks like it's done on purpose, but it was just the images that I was able to find to show the kind of scenes that I wanted to share with you. So it's just that there are kind of different artistic design. But you're right that to notice that because the upper class portrait was very rich colours, and that was all part of that kind of portraiture tradition, whereas these were kind of more informational to show the scenes family members. Okay, so life really was very hard for these children, and so we mentioned about it being difficult conditions. It was very overcrowded. There wasn't good sanitation, and so often there'd be lots of diseases happening as well. And because of this, some parents just didn't have the resources to look after their children. So there was actually a lot of children that would be abandoned, so kind of left because their parents couldn't look after them. So it's up to kind of 1,000. There's a particular problem in London. But fortunately, some people were doing things to try and help with this. So you may have heard already about a place called the Foundling Hospital. So I'll show you that on the next slide. On the left, you can see some artwork of the building of the Foundling Hospital. Now, rather than it being a hospital like we think of today, hospital was to kind of represent that it was being hospitable. So it was take children that would otherwise be abandoned into their care and kind of raise them. So it was founded in the kind of Bloomsbury Holborn area of London, and indeed today there's a museum called the Foundling Museum, which when it reopens, I really recommend visiting. And the outside of the building is different, but on the inside, it has a lot of the original 18th century rooms. So it was founded by a gentleman called Thomas Coram, who was just really sad to see all of this difficult times for these poorer families in London. And so he founded the hospital, and so it was a charity. And it could be used by mothers who were in search for a better life for their child. So they would take them to the hospital, and when they left them, they would often leave them with a kind of token, a keepsake, and that would mean that if they ever wanted to be reunited, then they could kind of explain that, and they could be reunited with their child. And if you do visit the Foundling Museum, they may even have images of this online. You can see some of those tokens. So often scraps of fabric or coins. And it's very, very moving to see. So when a child arrived at the hospital, they would, if they had to be under a year old, so they'd be a baby, and for the first 5 or so years of their life, they'd be sent to the countryside to a sort of nurse and be brought up there. And they'd come back to the hospital and they'd get schooling up until the age of 15. And then they'd be sent off into apprenticeships or into jobs. So thinking about those classes, it would be a way to kind of move from the lower classes to what would be the middle classes through the involvement of the hospital. So it did really amazing work. And as well as the museum that exists today, there's still a charity called Coram, which does lots of work with children too. So there's still this kind of legacy of what Thomas Coram set out to do. And you may have heard of it also because if you're a fan of Jacqueline Wilson's books, she's written some books about a character called Hetty Feather that links with this history. And whereas the workhouses that we spoke about often could be bad conditions and the families wouldn't be fed very well, at the Foundling Hospital, everyone was really well fed. The image on the right is from a bit later in the 19th century, but shows a kind of meal time. You can see all of the foundlings in their uniforms as well. So it did some really amazing work. So I can see we've got some comments in the chat. So let me see. And someone mentioned the book Coram Boy as well. It's a fantastic book. Okay. And someone's asked if kids were paid to work in the lower classes. Normally they wouldn't be paid, but they would be given kind of accommodation and food in exchange. So they would go into those jobs as a way to survive because of not being able to afford kind of shelter and food. So because of these conditions in the crowded cities, there was a very high child mortality rate. So lots of children unfortunately dying when they were very young. So at the sort of end of the 18th century, 1 in 3 children born in cities wouldn't make it to their first birthday. So it's a really difficult situation. And this is partly because medicine and what doctors knew hadn't got to the stage of what it has now. So so there was lots of progress to be made there, and it wasn't just the case for the lower classes. You know, diseases could affect all families, all children, and in fact that's something that sadly happened to Benjamin Franklin. So I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. More questions? Hello, Georgia.
Would the children still be sent to the workhouse?
What would the ones at the Foundling Hospital?
No, any other children.
Yeah, so exactly. So it wasn't just if you were adults, it was the whole family, so children as well. Okay, brilliant. So looking at the next slide. So I mentioned that unfortunately, because doctors didn't know as much as they do now, and there was quite a high rate of child mortality. And sadly, Benjamin Franklin, who you can see on the right, his first son with his wife Deborah passed away when he was only 4 years old. So there's a picture of him on the right. He was called Francis Folger Franklin, and he contracted something called smallpox, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was a disease that could be very dangerous. And after he died, Franklin became a really big advocate for inoculation. So we're thinking a lot about the vaccine at the moment, as a kind of early version of that. So because medicine hadn't developed to the same level as it has today, it could be quite illnesses, diseases that either don't exist or still exist today, could be far more dangerous. So so sadly, Franklin experienced that too. For you, since we've been thinking about children and families, can anyone think of what historians use to help them map out a family's history? Straight away, Betty has put a family tree, exactly. So I'll show you some now. So we saw Franklin's son, Francis Folger, and his middle name actually came from Franklin's mother, who was called Abia Folger Franklin. And this portrait on the left is believed to be a portrait of her. And she came from the Folger family, which were one of the first settlers in New England in America. And the picture on the right is this beautiful family tree. So it shows all the different generations of the family. And normally in a family tree, you have the older generations at the top, and then coming down to the younger generations at the bottom. So this is a beautiful historic one that I wanted to share with you, but I'll show you a kind of simpler one of Benjamin Franklin's immediate family as another example. So here we go, we have Franklin's family tree, and this family tree comes from a wonderful website. If you're interested in finding out more about Benjamin Franklin, it's benfranklin300.org, and this was a website that was set up for a special exhibition to mark what would have been Franklin's 300th birthday in 2006, and it's got lots of information about him, and that's the year that Benjamin Franklin House opened actually as well, so to mark his 300th birthday. So here we have a family tree. So we have Benjamin Franklin and Deborah at the top. That was his wife. Before he married Deborah, we don't actually know who with, but Franklin had a son, William Franklin. So you can see him on the next row down. And then we have the two children that Benjamin and Deborah had together. So Francis, also known as Frankie, and Sarah, also known as Sally. And then Sarah married someone called Richard Bache, and then you can see the descendants coming down from them as well. So after this class, if you'd like to carry on thinking about sort of family history, my suggestion for an activity you might like to try is creating your own family tree. So this one is just really Franklin's immediate family and then showing descendants, but you might want to go back a bit, so thinking about grandparents. This one is nice, it has the images of the different family members, if you want to include photos or drawings, or you could just have the kind of map with their names on as well. So that's my suggestion for something you might want to try after the class. But I'll see if we have any questions before we finish. Someone's asked why there's no image of Richard Bache. I think that's because we don't have a portrait of Richard, unfortunately. So that's why he's not got a portrait there. Okay, another raised hand. Hello?
Who's the person who has a question mark on it?
So that is the person that Benjamin Franklin had his son William with. We don't actually know who that was. And William grew up in the family with Benjamin and Deborah. So that's a bit of one of those mysteries of history historians have not been able to find out, even with all of the sources and things they can use to help them. Okay, and then are there living descendants of Benjamin Franklin? There are indeed. So they all came through this Beige family line with Sarah, because William did have a son, William Temple Franklin, but he didn't have any children. So all the descendants are through his daughter Sarah and Richard Beige, who she married. And there are still some today. And one actually visited the house, Benjamin Franklin House, in 2019. So that was very exciting. I'll just check the Q&A as well if there's any questions here. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a really good half-term week ahead and hope to see you again soon. Bye, everyone.